If you would take out your Psalter and turn to page 36. We're looking at Psalm 131 today, another of the Psalms of Ascent sung by God's ancient people as they made their way to Jerusalem to worship, to celebrate, to give thanks and praise to God for God's involvement in their life as a people, not just individuals, but as a people. Would you read this Psalm of David together with me? Together? O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like a weaned child that is with me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time on and forevermore. This is the word of the Lord. Perhaps you have heard the country western tune. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. It's an old Mac Davis hit. But I read a couple of stories this week that illustrate this song really well. The first was about Henry Augustus Rowland. And he was once a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University who was called as an expert witness at a trial. And during the cross-examination, the defense lawyer demanded, "What are your qualifications as an expert witness in this case?" And the normally modest and retiring professor replied quietly, "Well, it happens that I'm the greatest living expert on the subject at hand." Well, that was out of character, and so later a good friend expressed his surprise at the professor's response, and Rowland answered, "Well, what did you expect me to do? I was under oath." And then a story about George Washington Carver, the scientist who developed hundreds of useful products from the peanut, including one of my favorites, peanut butter. In his autobiography, which I read many years ago as a youngster, he wrote, "When I was young, I said to God, 'God, tell me the mystery of the universe.' But God answered, 'That knowledge is reserved for me alone.' And so I said, 'Well, God, tell me the mystery of the peanut.' Then God said, 'Well, George, that's more nearly your size.' And he told me. My heart is not lifted up, the psalmist writes. Humility is the message of our psalm this morning. Humility, contentment, and hope. The closer a human being comes toward God, whether it's an ancient people traveling to Jerusalem to experience and worship God's presence in its temple, or it's a modern day pilgrim making their way during the Lenten season to a cross outside Jerusalem, the closer you come to God, the more apt you are to experience what it means to be humbled, what it means to be content, and where true hope is to be found. Now, humility may be the most elusive of all Christian virtues, because the moment you know you have it or say anything like that, you've lost it, right? And that actually was my first thought when I read the opening lines of Psalm 131. a psalm attributed to King David, who says, "Oh, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high." And at first, it sounds as if David is bragging about his humility, doesn't it? Which, of course, would have been to assert his pride. But after a moment or two of reflection, I realized this written public declaration really comes from a private conversation. David is praying to the Lord here. And the Lord is not one to be spoofed. David is real. He's being authentic, truthful. And these statements, shared in secret, have been kind of leaked out to us by the Lord in this psalm to teach us that genuine humility is characteristic of a mature faith. The more faith grows up, the harder it is to be prideful. John Stott once wrote, "At every stage of our Christian development and in every sphere of our Christian discipleship, pride is our greatest enemy and humility is our greatest friend." Now, it's hard if pride is the enemy. I mean, it is hard to fight off pride. Placing ourselves at the center. Thinking more of ourselves than we ought. Putting down or looking down, as David writes, on others in order to elevate ourselves, even incrementally. Acting as if we know more than we do around others. Thinking about our circumstances, I don't really belong here. I deserve better. And our culture is no help to us. We live in a day in which pride is not condemned as a vice, but instead is celebrated as a virtue. An age where we are encouraged to assert ourselves, where power and control may be questioned, but they are also very highly regarded, where self-sufficiency, self-importance, self-promotion are viewed as almost attractive qualities to have. Consider the kinds of people who are honored and respected in our culture. Professional athletes, movie actors and actresses, influential politicians, TV personalities, wealthy business people. Do terms like humble, modest, self-effacing come to your mind? There was a time in America when those who had been blessed with great talent or success were expected to at least maintain the pretense of humility. But today, by and large, those who make it to the top don't even try to hide their immense self-regard. They're proud and proud of it. And so as pride is associated with all these images of happy, successful people, we begin to think of it less as a spiritual defect and more as something to be desired and even encouraged. It's hard to recognize pride as a sin when it is so regularly rewarded as an achievement. And so it is a struggle not to think too highly or too little of ourselves. That's a struggle for many also, isn't it? Too many mistakenly assume That the opposite of pride means being timid or insecure, thinking you're of little value or significance, having a low opinion of yourself. But humility is not inferiority, nor is it poor self-esteem. It's not about having a low opinion or a high opinion of yourself. It's about having the right opinion of yourself from God's perspective, which means understanding and living as a child of the living God. Someone who has been made in the image of God to reflect godly characteristics. Someone who belongs to God, is loved by God, blessed by God. But also a recalcitrant child. Someone who wants their own way. A human being who has a definite propensity to forget God. To try to be your own God. For the Christian, humility is seeing who you are. Your strengths and weaknesses honestly. And not pretending you are something more. The word humility, of course, comes from the Latin humus, which means earth or ground, and points us to living a life that is grounded, maintaining a truthful, modest, and accurate estimate of ourselves, our true personal capacities and capabilities. And so the psalmist says, and the people on their way to Jerusalem sing, I do not occupy myself with things too great or too marvelous for me. I have learned not to reach beyond my grasp. I'm willing to admit there are things beyond my comprehension that I cannot understand nor have the ability to do anything about. And that's okay, because I'm learning to act humbly. I'm leaving behind arrogance and pride. I'm practicing how to be content with the way God has made me and the limits and the boundaries that are mine as a human being who is both a saint and a sinner. My faith is maturing. I'm growing up, both in my humanity and my faith. I'm not caught up in greatness or achievements or accomplishments as the measure of my life. Rather, I maintain a lowly, humble walk before the Lord, bowing and deferring to God's great power and wisdom. In other words, the psalmist is saying, I've quit trying to play God. I'm letting God be God. Well, how about you? Have you quit trying to play God? Or are you still desperately, anxiously scrambling to control everything and everyone around you? I once saw a sign on a wall that read, "Good morning, this is God. I will be handling all your problems today. I will not need you to lead, so relax and have a great day." It's okay that the world doesn't march to your orders. Okay that you don't have to inform everyone else what you think about every issue that comes along. It's okay. Seems everyone has an opinion these days, right? Whether you know the facts or not, and social media makes it even easier to broadcast those opinions to others. The message is chill out. Relax. You might make a wonderful person, but you make a terrible God. The psalmist goes on to use a powerful image to point out that acting humbly and enjoying the contentedness that follows doesn't come easily. Something that's not really a surprise. Humility and contentedness are not qualities that come automatically to anyone, whether they're people of faith or not. If you look at verse 2 of the psalm, but I have stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. In other words, quietness of spirit. The contentedness that humility brings is not easy. It has to be struggled for. It's work. As anyone with children knows, the process of weaning a child from the breast is not easy. My grandson, Luca, is in the process of being weaned. And I might call my daughter during the week, and what I hear is him wailing in the background, screaming, crying. I have watched. He doesn't want the cup, the plate, the bottle, the strained vegetables, the cream of wheat. They all end up on the floor. He wants what he has always known, and he wants it now. And yet Johanna, his mother, has to withhold what she knows he wants and feels he has to have in order for her son to mature, to grow up. And in the end, he will learn not to demand what he thinks he must have, but rest content in his mother's arms. His mother's presence and closeness will be enough. Just as we learn to be satisfied, not because God meets our every demand, but because of God's commitment to always be present and near, to shield and protect and nurture and provide support. What a wonderful motherly image Scripture paints of God here. God doesn't want us to be childish, but God does call us to be childlike. Jesus said, you remember? I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. The Apostle Paul wrote, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it's like to be in need. I know what it's like to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in plenty or in want. The calmed, quieted, contented soul is not just a special gift from God that somehow drops out of heaven into our lives. It's the fruit of the Spirit's work and our own. something that results from learning and growing and practicing and letting go of all the fussing and whining and desperation. Letting go of all the comparing yourself to others. Letting go of trying to run other people's lives, let alone your own. And learning to live humbly. Allowing ourselves to draw near and rest not in ourselves, but in a caring, mother-like God. Relying on the promise that God will watch over our coming in and our going out all the days of our lives. Then there is peace. Then there is contentment. And then there is hope. Hope for the Christian is not wishful thinking. It is the joyful anticipation of what God will do when we stop believing only in ourselves and put our confidence in the Lord. And because this is so, as they journeyed together, God's people sang these words of encouragement to one another. O Israel, O people of Christ Presbyterian Church, put your hope in the Lord. Today, tomorrow, and forevermore.